Hey everyone, welcome to your next installment of the GoldenGate Tech Talk series. This is your source for informative and timely tech topics about GoldenGate software, data replication, and cloud data integration. The industry-leading data replication software for more than 20 years, GoldenGate is still innovating today and helping thousands of leading brands get the most business value out of their data. As a multi-cloud capable replication engine, GoldenGate helps customers maintain seamless integration across their public clouds. But what makes GoldenGate really special is the breadth and attention to enterprise-class solutions for databases, cloud, big data, NoSQL, and streaming technologies of all kinds, not just Oracle. GoldenGate's rock-solid foundation is the best-in-class for data high availability, high-speed transaction replication, and data warehouse loading. But modern data challenges require the most innovative solutions, and GoldenGate delivers on world-class data lake ingestion, stream data processing for real-time ETL, and advanced stream analytics that include geofencing, time series processing, and machine learning integrations. As a platform for modern data integration, GoldenGate just can't be beat. Well, that's about it for the intro. Let's get on with today's tech topic.
Hi, my name is Mac, and today I'll present to you how to set up and configure Oracle GoldenGate for SQL Server, and we'll do a sample replication, data replication from a source SQL Server 2014 database into a SQL Server 2016 database. And I'm just using those two versions as an example, but for GoldenGate 19.1, which is our most current version as of today, the versions of SQL Server that are supported are SQL Server 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2017. So let's start with downloading the software. I'm actually going to go to support.oracle.com to get the software. I want to check under patches and updates, and this is just a recommendation in general to if you're just installing the software brand new, you can find the base version of a release on the GoldenGate OTN site or the Oracle eDelivery Cloud site. But I normally just check for the patches and updates first, and I do know, for example, that as of February of 2020, we did come out with a patch for SQL Server. So I'm going to start by just providing the information and find the build that I want and download it. So to look for a certain patch version, you get this long list of numbers, but I know, for example, that this is the one that I'm looking for, and you can see in the end field of the version number, it's got 20 for the year 20, 02 for February, and 04 for the day. So I'll select that. I'm also going to kind of reduce the output in case there are other builds. This is platform specific. So I'm going to download the GoldenGate for SQL Server where GoldenGate runs on Windows, but as of GoldenGate 19.1, there is a build of GoldenGate that can run on Linux and support SQL Server on Windows. But for this example, I know for the demonstration today that I'll be installing GoldenGate on Windows. So let's search for the binary. Here it is. This is the patch I want. I don't have to, I'm not going to overlay this over an earlier install of GoldenGate 19.1. This patch is a full install. It's a zip file. I'm going to unzip it. I'll save it and unzip it. So it's defaulted to a folder that I'm using, but that I've already created. But in essence, it's this is the folder. This is my name, and this is where I want to install the GoldenGate. So I'm going to download the file there. We'll wait for that to complete, which it's already done. So let's go into that folder. I'll minimize this information. Now to start, I'm just going to extract it with a zip program. I'm going to use Windows zip in this file, in this example. Now before I go into the next steps, this is my installation folder. We're almost close to having it installed, to be honest with you. But there is one thing I want to do, and this is needed for some of the databases that we support, but it's definitely needed for GoldenGate for SQL Server. I'm going to create a document, and it's going to be a very specific file. It's called globals, and it's all uppercase, and it does not have an extension, but I'm going to go ahead and leave the extension now and edit the file, and then I'll remove the extension. But what I'm going to put in here is a required parameter that we need for GoldenGate for SQL Server, and it's called GG schema. And I'm going to create a schema in the database later and just call it OGG. So I'm going to go ahead and log that information in here now. I'll save the file. I'll rename the extension. Well, actually, I'll remove the extension. And now what I'm going to do is run GoldenGate. So this is the classic architecture. If you're familiar with GoldenGate, there's two architectures out right now, microservices and classic. For GoldenGate 19.1, we only have the classic architecture for the SQL Server product. So to configure GoldenGate, I use the GGSCI executable, allow it to run, and this is the interface pretty much to everything GoldenGate in the classic architecture. So the first command I'm going to do is a required command to finish the installation of GoldenGate, and there it is. Create subdirs. So GoldenGate's officially installed. Next, what we want to do is configure some components, namely what's called a manager of GoldenGate. So I'll start by creating a manager parameter file. This has there's a lot of parameters that can go in here and tell GoldenGate processes how to run, but the only one I really need, and this is the one I'll use to start, is just a port. So this is going to tell me which port do I want the manager process to run on this operating system, on this Windows server that I'm running GoldenGate on. So this is a required parameter. The port value is up to you. I'll use 7809. Save and close the file. And now, if I run a command info all, I can see I've got a manager. Now that the parameter file exists, GGSCI has interpreted that there is a manager, and I can start it with this command, and manager is up and running. There's a couple of options for GoldenGate on Windows. One is to have the manager process and all processes underneath run in this interactive mode where manager pops up, and then I'm going to later add a process called an extract and a process called a replicat, and those two will pop up as windows here. Optionally, and what I would do for production would be to create this process as a service, and then everything would run as a Windows service, the GoldenGate processes. So let me just do that now. I'll stop the manager, and shell, I'm going to pass a command back into the operating system, but basically I'm going to run a program in the GoldenGate installation called install and add service, and the default service name is ggsmgr. I can change that through another parameter in the globals file, but I'll leave the default. And now, let's see if this takes effect immediately. Yeah, now when I started manager, you notice that it didn't pop up in the background because it's actually now running as a service. And you can see it through my service applet. There it is. It's up and running. You can set other how you want it to start up if you want to use a different account other than local system, but I'll just leave everything the same for now. So let's go on to the next step. Let's prep the databases for GoldenGate. And so now let's continue to SQL Server. I want to create the logins that I need for GoldenGate and create the databases and the tables that I will use in the replication. So looking at my two SQL Server environments that I've got, these are actually both running on this same machine, but of course these could be on another server or on other servers, wherever they happen to be running. And I can install GoldenGate on those servers, but in this case I'm installing it on the same server where everything's running. But you could also consider this as a hub environment. For example, if you didn't want to install GoldenGate on the database server, then you could install it on its own Windows server or its own Linux server. So let's start. I've got a database called Source 2014. I'll use this as my source. And now my target, I've created a database called Target 2016. First thing I want to do, I mentioned the GG schema parameter in the globals file that we used, and what that's going to do is tie to a schema that I create in the database. So it definitely needs to be in the source database. Doesn't always need to be in a target, but there are some cases that we would create the source schema in the target database. If you're using a checkpoint table for the replicat, for example, you can create the objects underneath that name. It's a recommended practice, so I'll go ahead and do that for both databases, source and target. Now, logins. In this example, the presentation today, I'll use SQL Server logins, but we can use, GoldenGate can use Windows authentication to connect and pull data from the database, pull and push the data. So I've gone ahead and set up, same as my schema name, I've set up a SQL Server login called OGG, and I've done this on both source and target instances. In the source, permissions wise for this account, I've granted it sysadmin. I do need sysadmin rights for this account for a few steps at the beginning, but for the process that is going to replicate data from the source to the target on that source, I can set the permissions lower to DB owner for the database that I'm interested in capturing from. But for now, I do need sysadmin to run a few steps. So once we're done with those steps, then I can transition over and change the permission to DB owner and remove sysadmin. Let's create just a simple table. I don't have any user tables here right now, but let's just go ahead and create one as an example, and we'll use it. I'm just going to use a very simple table as an example to replicate. I'll create that on both my source and target databases. And voila, that's the table we'll use to replicate data from the 2014 instance to the 2016 instance. So next steps. So I mentioned I needed sysadmin. It's because we're going to enable change data capture on this source database, on the source 2014 database. So let's start with creating a DSN. The GoldenGate processes use a system DSN on the server, and currently in GoldenGate 19.1, the drivers that we support are the 11, ODBC 11, 13, 17. We have backwards compatibility support for the SNAC 11 drivers. But in this example, I'm going to create a system DSN with the ODBC 17 driver. I'll create one DSN for the source and one DSN for the target. So they must be system DSNs, not user DSN. I'll go through the process of setting that up. I'll give it a name, source 2014. Connecting to my instance. SQL Server authentication. Now this is important. I need to change the database to where I want the GoldenGate process to connect to and pull data from. We only support user databases. We do not support the system databases. So I'll select my source, leave the defaults, do a quick test. Everything's fine. And I'll create another one for my target. Okay, now that I have both DSNs in place that I need first step I'm going to do is prep the source database for what we call supplemental logging. That term means different things for different databases, but in our case, what essentially we're going to do is run a GoldenGate command that will enable the database for SQL Server change data capture and enable the table for change data capture as well. So to do so, first I call up the dblogin sourcedb command within ggSCI, and then I'll reference the DSN name that I created, source 2014, with user ID, OGG, password happens to be the same. Now, right now you can see this is all in clear text, but there is another method to create SQL passwords. It's called a credential store within GoldenGate, and if you look in the reference guide for what's called user ID alias, you can see how to configure that, where you would not end up providing the password every time you needed to run this. But for simplicity, I'm just going to use the clear text and the login information. Okay, well, it's not always great to have an error when you're doing a demonstration, but I did find what my error is already. So notice here my DSN is spelled correctly as I want it to be, SOURSE 2014. However, as you're watching this video, and you may have paused as I'm typing, and you may have backed up to correct me, but as you can see, I created the name here is incorrect. So let me just correct that. Test failed because I didn't redo the password, but I know it'll work. All right, let's try this again. There we go. Okay. So we're logged into the database, and the command I was talking about, supplemental logging, is called trend data. So I can look at the current status of trend data for the table or tables in the database, and I'll use a wildcard. And the first thing we see is that the database is disabled for change data capture is disabled for the database. So let's start with just running what I want to do. Now, in this case, I only have one user table in the database. So if I did dbo.star, if I had enabled supplemental logging for dbo.star, it might not be a big deal. But if I had a lot of tables in the database, and of those tables I was only interested in replicating data for a handful, then I certainly would not want to enable supplemental logging on all the tables, but only the tables I'm interested in. So let's just do that. Let's be very specific to what we want to replicate. In this case, I know there's only one table, but we'll spell it out by name rather than use a wildcard. And I can hit the up arrow and rerun the command I had before, and I can see that supplemental logging is enabled for the test table. So there we go. That's supplemental logging. It's under the covers. It's using the Microsoft change data capture feature. It's enabled it for the database, and it's enabled for the table as well. I do not need to do this on the target. The target, I'm just going to be replicating data into it. I'm not going to be capturing data from it. So my target connection is just going to be over TCP/IP over that DSN that I created, and we'll be delivering data as if it were a user coming into the database through an application. All right, so supplemental logging has been enabled for the test table. The next step in configuring GoldenGate for a source database is to create the GoldenGate cleanup task. Since we are using the SQL Server change data capture feature, reading data from the transaction log, and then that stores in CDC staging tables. I'll show you those, for example. So this is the CDC staging table that correlates to the test table that we created. So this is a result of add trend data and Oracle's GoldenGate running the Microsoft store procedures for change data capture. But what that also does is creates two jobs, one for each database that you end up enabling GoldenGate for. You'll see the capture job and the cleanup job. The cleanup job is the Microsoft cleanup job that has default settings of nightly run, and it purges data from these capture instance tables, these change data capture tables, as well as from the LSN time mapping table. But what it doesn't do is take into account that the extract process that we have may need some of the data from these tables. So what we do for production is delete it or drop it. So I'm just going to use the Microsoft command to drop it. Going to use drop job. We're going to drop the cleanup job. Run that command. Refresh. The job should be going. Now, the next step we're going to do is to run some GoldenGate a batch file and pass in connection information so that it can create the GoldenGate cleanup job. And this cleanup job will take into account that there's an extract process, and it will take into account the extracts recovery checkpoint so that it won't purge data out of these tables that are needed by the extract. So let's do that. It's also in the directory, but I can use a shell command within GGSCI to run files at the back in the directory. So this is the file name. And what I have to do is pass a few parameters to it. The first being create the job. So options are create job, drop job. You can get help on it. It'll give you an example of what you have to do. So we're going to create the job, and the syntax is the password that we use for the user, user ID, the password happens to be the same in my case, the database name, and the instance, the server/instance. So we're not using the DSN that we created to connect to the database for the shell script for the .batch file. So we're going to just use the instance. In this case, it's local host for me. The instance is SQL 2014. And then the schema, so the OGG schema, which is an example of what we used in the GGS schema parameter. So in this case, it's also OGG. So we passed that information. It connected. It ran. This does require sysadmin. So I mentioned permissions earlier that we had to start with sysadmin for the setup, but past this point, we no longer need sysadmin for this OGG account that I'll be using for the extract. We can set it to DB owner for the database, and that's the highest permissions that it would actually need from this point out. If I refresh my jobs, I now see a GoldenGate cleanup job. I've also got some additional tables that were added from that. This checkpoint and cleanup status. This information is populated by the extract. There'll be a record, one record per extract if you happen to have multiple extracts running on this database. Typically we just start with one and work off of that. Normally you don't need more than one extract, but there'll be one record, and then every 5 minutes the extract that I create will update this record and let the cleanup job know that this is my recovery checkpoint. Don't delete data past this point in time. So let's begin now by adding the extract. So I've already got a extract parameter file that I created. So we'll walk through that and just show you how it was set up. Extract, this is required. So extract has to be here. It's up to 8 character name. Source DB is another connection parameter for SQL Server, and I've given it the DSN that we created, the name of the DSN, user ID, password. Trail is where I want this extract to write the data that it captures from the database. So the trail will be in this local directory, the dir directory of the GoldenGate install, and it'll have a 2-character prefix of EA. That's the maximum allowed. And that will produce a series of trail files that have the name EA and 9 digits after them, and they roll over at 500 megabytes by default, but you could adjust that as well. And this will be the trail that the replicat process that I create later will read from to pull the data back out and write into the target database. So I've told it which table I want to capture from. In this case, I've listed the wildcard, but I could, since we only have one table, in this example, I'll just list that one table. Okay, save, close the file. Now I'm going to register the extract with the manager, and the way to do that is to say add extract, the name that I gave it, translog begin now. The begin now time can be, you can actually put an actual explicit time for where you want the extract to try to position and capture data from. You can also list an LSN. If you look at the LSN time mapping table and found the top LSN out of there, you could list that as well, and it would start reading data from that point on. But typically, just for ease, I'm just going to list begin now. Then one more requirement that I have to do is I have to bind the trail that I listed in the extract parameter and let the manager know that. So this is how you do that. And bind it to my extract exta. Okay, that's fine. This message, I did a step earlier on this system when I was preparing for the presentation, so I forgot to remove the binding in GDSI, but that's fine. Let's make sure the extract is now showing up. Yep, it's registered in a stop state. Let's try to start it. Ran into an issue, probably related to the extract trail. No, okay. Okay, sorry, it was just a timing issue. So now the extract is running, and so you can see the lag at checkpoint was at 1:38. That's because I used the begin now time. I created it, I guess, 1 minute and 38 seconds ago, and then it updated. So when lag at checkpoint goes to 0 and time since checkpoint, this value rolls over every 10 seconds. When those zero out pretty much, or in this range of when the time since checkpoint is between 0 and 10, then I know everything's current. So my extract is up and running. So now let's create a replicat. So I'm going to create the replicat parameter files, call it rep_a, replicat rep_a. Use the connection string, so instead of source DB, I'll use target DB, provide the DSN of target 2016, password, user ID and password were the same. And then to map the table from the source, I use the command, the parameter map. I'll say dbo dot, for ease, dbo dot star, target dbo dot star. I could also be explicit and say map dbo dot test table to target dbo dot test table. If I had changed my target table name to something other than the source, I would list that here as well. So I would have said map test table to target dbo dot test table 2 or whatever I want to call it. I don't have to keep the same names at the tables or at the columns with GoldenGate. So simply simple file, that's it. That's a replicat file, and let's save that, close that. Now the next step we want to do is similar to the extract having a extract checkpoint table. We want to create a checkpoint table for our replicat as well. This is used for recovery purposes. So if the replicat were to append on the target, and perhaps the checkpoint file that the replicat uses was corrupted, it first would check this checkpoint table that is going to be written into the database. So let's log into the target database and we'll create a checkpoint table. Add checkpoint table is the command. We're going to use the OGG schema and call it whatever we want. I'm just going to call it GG checkpoint. Next we'll add the replicat. And we're giving it the xtrail is the information that we used for the extract. So the extract is writing to the EA trail file and the replicat will read from that. And then we use the checkpoint table option and list the name of the checkpoint file table that we created. see its status. Let's start it up. Okay, now the extractor is running, the replicator is running. Now we can insert some data into the source and then query the target to make sure it got across. So insert test table. Guys, again, for simplicity, I just used a simple table. Query the source. See that the records are there. Now let's go to the target. We'll run a query over there. And voila, that's it. So GoldenGate for SQL Server 19.1, replicating in this scenario from SQL Server 2014 to SQL Server 2016. Look out for some more presentations I'll be doing around SQL Server, and thanks for your time. Bye.
Hey everyone, thanks again for tuning in to this edition of the GoldenGate Tech Talk series. Be sure to check out all the other cool Tech Talks that are out there and stay tuned for more as they become available.